He didn't notice when I cried in the shower, didn't care when I stopped saying I love you, didn't see how lonely I had become. But someone else did. He saw me, heard me, made me feel alive again. One evening, my husband finally looked at me and smiled. "You seem happier lately." I took a deep breath and whispered, "Because I finally feel wanted." His smile faded. "By who?" he demanded. I met his eyes and said, "By a man who actually notices me." His hands shook, and that's when he knew he had pushed me straight into someone else's arms. I don't know if I'm looking for advice, validation, or just a place to spill everything I've been holding inside. But here it is. The whole ugly, beautiful, complicated mess. I, 38 female, have been married to my husband, Mark, 42 male, for 15 years. We live in Austin, Texas, in a quiet neighborhood with good schools, friendly neighbors, and the kind of houses that all look the same. We have 2 kids, a mortgage, and a life that, on paper, is perfectly fine. Except it's not. Somewhere along the way, my marriage became a place I existed in, not a place I lived. It was like I had fallen into a routine that never changed, a cycle of waking up, making breakfast, school drop-offs, work, dinner, bed. And in between all of that, I was invisible. Mark used to be different. Or maybe I used to see him differently. When we first met, he was the kind of man who could make me laugh so hard I'd snort. He noticed things, small things. Like when I had a bad day. When I needed a hug but didn't know how to ask for it. When I changed my shampoo. But that version of him is gone. Now, he comes home late, barely says a word, and spends most nights staring at his phone. If he touches me, it's in passing. If we talk, it's about bills or groceries, or what time the kids' soccer game is. There's no affection, no warmth, no us anymore. Just 2 people who happen to live in the same house. I thought it was just a rough patch. I told myself that things would get better. But then one day, I realized I couldn't even remember the last time he looked at me like I was someone he wanted. And that broke something in me. I tried to fix it. I tried dressing up, wearing my hair differently, putting effort into date nights that he either ignored or canceled last minute. I tried talking to him about it, but every conversation ended the same way, with him sighing, telling me he was tired, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. And then there were the nights I cried in the shower, because at least in there, no one could hear me. And then there was him. His name is Daniel. I met him at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place with overpriced lattes and baristas who look like they walked straight out of an indie film. I work from home as a freelance editor, and on the days when the silence of my house was too much, I'd go there to work. Daniel was always there. Late 40s, silver streaks in his dark hair, always dressed sharp, but not in a way that felt forced. He had this presence about him, calm, collected, like someone who actually paid attention to the world around him. At first, we were just 2 strangers who happened to order coffee at the same time. Then, small talk. He'd glance at the book I was reading and make a comment about it. I'd tease him about his black coffee addiction. It was nothing, until it wasn't. One day, I walked in feeling particularly awful. Mark had forgotten our anniversary. Just forgot. Not even an "oh, I'm so sorry" after I reminded him that morning. Nothing. I had spent the whole day pretending it didn't hurt, smiling through it, and by the time I got to the cafe, I felt like I was about to explode. Daniel looked up when I walked in. And then he said, "Rough day?" Just 2 words. But I almost broke down right there. Because when was the last time someone asked me that? When was the last time someone noticed? I sat with him that day. I didn't mean to. I just needed someone to talk to. And he listened. Actually listened. Not the way Mark did, with one eye on his phone, nodding absent-mindedly. No, Daniel listened like what I was saying mattered. And it felt good. God, it felt good to be seen. After that, we started talking more. We'd sit together at the cafe, sometimes for hours. It was easy with him. He made me laugh. He made me feel interesting again, like I wasn't just a wife and a mother, but a person. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. Then one evening, he reached for the sugar packet at the same time I did, and our hands brushed. Just that, nothing more. But my heart raced. And I knew. I knew I was already in trouble. Because when was the last time I had felt that? That night, when I got home, I waited for Mark to say something. Anything. To ask why I was late. To ask why I looked different. But he didn't. I could have told him the truth right then. That I was lonely. That I was drowning. That I needed him to care. Instead, I climbed into bed beside him, turned off the light, and stared at the ceiling while he scrolled through his phone. And all I could think was, he has no idea he's already losing me. The next time I saw Daniel, I kissed him. Or maybe he kissed me. I don't know. All I know is that I didn't stop it. And once you cross that line, you can't uncross it. We started seeing each other in secret. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional. I'd text him about things I used to tell Mark. He'd check in on me during the day, ask if I'd eaten, tell me I looked beautiful even when I didn't feel it. I know what you're thinking. If it was so bad, why not just leave? And I wish I had a good answer. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was because, despite everything, I still hoped Mark would notice. That he'd wake up one day and see what was happening, see how far gone I already was. But he didn't. And then, one night, as we sat across from each other at dinner, he actually looked at me. Really looked at me. "You seem happier lately," he said, almost surprised. I swallowed hard. My hands tightened around my fork. "I finally feel wanted." His brow furrowed. By who? I could have lied. I could have spared him. But I was tired. So I met his eyes and told him the truth. And that was the moment he knew. That was the moment everything shattered. Mark didn't say anything right away. He just stared at me, his fork frozen midair, his face completely blank, like his brain hadn't caught up to what I had just said. I saw his throat move as he swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Then, finally, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, "What the hell does that mean?" The way he said it, slow, deliberate, like he was giving me a chance to take it back, made my stomach clench. I could have backpedaled. I could have told him I was just feeling lonely and said something stupid. But I didn't want to take it back. Because it was the truth. So I said, "It means exactly what it sounds like." His jaw twitched. His hands shook. He looked down at his plate like he was trying to make sense of the food in front of him, like the sight of mashed potatoes and overcooked chicken would somehow help him process the fact that his wife had just told him she felt wanted by another man. Then, suddenly, he let out a sharp laugh. But there was no humor in it. It was sharp, bitter, ugly. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. "You're actually serious." I didn't say anything. Because what was there to say? Mark pushed his chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. He stood up, pacing, breathing heavily, hands on his hips like he didn't know what to do with them. He looked at me again, this time with something dark in his eyes. "Who?" His voice was tight, shaking. "Who is he?" I hesitated. Not because I wanted to protect Daniel. But because, for the first time, I realized I was afraid. Mark wasn't a violent man. He never had been. Not once in our marriage. But right now, with his entire body tense like a wire about to snap, I wasn't so sure. "It doesn't matter." My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. His nostrils flared. "It matters to me." I looked away. "It's not about him, Mark. It's about us. Or the fact that there is no us anymore." His eyes flashed. "So, what?" "You decided to go and F someone else instead of talking to me." That made something inside me snap. "I did talk to you, Mark," I shot back, my voice shaking now too. "For years. I begged you to notice me. I tried everything to make you care. But you didn't. You never did. And now, suddenly, you give a damn?" He opened his mouth, then shut it again. For a second, neither of us spoke. Just the sound of our heavy breathing, the hum of the fridge, the distant sound of the TV from the living room where our kids were watching a cartoon, completely unaware that their parents' marriage was falling apart right there in the kitchen. Then, quietly, Mark asked, "Did you sleep with him?" I swallowed. Yes. I don't know what I expected. Anger, maybe. Shouting. Something. But Mark just stood there, his face blank, his breathing ragged. Then, after a long moment, he turned around, grabbed his keys from the counter, and walked out the front door without another word. I heard his car start, the tires screeching as he sped down the street. And just like that, he was gone. The house felt suffocating after that. The air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the front door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know where he had gone. I didn't know if he was coming back. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I wondered if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The kids came running in a few minutes later, asking where their dad had gone. I forced a smile, told them he just needed some air. They didn't question it. But when I put them to bed that night, I caught my oldest, our 10-year-old son, watching me with careful eyes. Like he knew something wasn't right. Like he knew that everything had just changed. Mark didn't come home that night. Or the next night. I tried calling. No answer. I texted. No reply. I even called his office, but they said he hadn't been in. That's when I started to panic. Because Mark was predictable. Boring, even. He had never not come home. By the third day, his brother, Kevin, called me. His voice was sharp, accusing. "What the F did you do?" My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Kevin scoffed. "Mark showed up at my place 2 nights ago, drunk out of his damn mind, talking about how his wife is screwing another guy. He's been crashing on my couch since. Won't talk to anyone. Won't eat. Just drinks. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against my temple. Kevin, I'd save it. His voice was cold. You know, I always thought you were one of the good ones. Guess I was wrong. And then he hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, my hands shaking. I had wanted Mark to notice. I had wanted him to care. But I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected him to break. Later that night, Daniel called. He had been texting, asking if I was okay, but I had been too overwhelmed to respond. When I finally picked up, his voice was soft, careful. How are you holding up? I wanted to say fine. I wanted to say don't worry about me. Instead, I broke down crying. He listened. He always listened. Then, after a long silence, he said something that made my blood run cold. He's not as innocent as you think, you know. I stopped breathing. What? Daniel exhaled. I wasn't going to say anything. I didn't want to make this worse for you. But if he's acting like you broke him, you deserve to know the truth. I gripped the phone tighter. Daniel, what the hell are you talking about? He hesitated. Then, finally, he said it. Mark's been cheating on you too. My entire body went still. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Because somewhere, deep down, I had always wondered. But hearing it out loud, hearing it from Daniel, it changed everything. For a long time, I just sat there, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. Daniel's words were still ringing in my ears. Mark's been cheating on you too. It didn't make sense. Mark barely looked at me. He barely touched me. He barely spoke to me unless it was about the kids or bills. The idea of him cheating seemed ridiculous. I almost laughed. But I didn't. Because deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to be ridiculous. Because if Mark had cheated first, didn't that make me less of the villain? Didn't that make him the one who broke us? I cleared my throat. Daniel, you don't get to say something like that and not explain. Silence. Then a sigh. I debated telling you, but if he's out there acting like some heartbroken victim, you deserve the truth. I swallowed hard. Then tell me. Another pause. Then, he's been sleeping with someone from his office. Her name is Becca. I felt my stomach twist. Becca. I knew that name. I had heard it 1,000 times in passing. She's just a friend, babe. She's the best assistant I've ever had. She's young, she's ambitious. She reminds me of you when you started working. And I had believed it. I had believed every word. I let out a shaky breath. How do you know? Daniel hesitated again. Because I've seen them together. The room felt like it was tilting. When, a few weeks ago, before you and I, he trailed off. I was having dinner with a client at a steakhouse near his office. I saw them at the bar, laughing, touching, looking at each other the way you and I do. My mouth felt dry. You're sure? I'm not an idiot, sweetheart. I know what cheating looks like. I didn't even know I was crying until I felt the tears slide down my cheeks. My whole body was trembling. Mark. My Mark. The man who had spent the last few days drowning in whiskey and self-pity because I had been unfaithful. The man who had stormed out of our house like I had ripped his heart straight from his chest. And he had been doing the same damn thing the whole time. I wiped my face roughly. Why didn't you tell me before? Daniel sighed. Because I knew you weren't ready to hear it. And I knew if I told you too soon, you'd hate me for it. I didn't know what to say. Because he wasn't wrong. I ended the call soon after, telling him I needed time to process. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not guilt. Not regret. Rage. Mark came home the next evening. I was in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine, trying to figure out if I should tell him what I knew or wait until I had more proof. But the second he walked through the door, looking exhausted and defeated, something inside me snapped. I turned to face him, my hands gripping the counter. How's Becca? He froze mid-step. And in that moment, I knew. I knew Daniel hadn't been lying. Mark's face didn't twist in confusion. He didn't say who? Or what are you talking about? His face just drained of color. His fingers twitched. He swallowed hard. Where did you hear that name? I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Wow, you're not even going to deny it. He took a slow step forward. Who told you? Does it matter? I took a sip of wine, my hands shaking. How long, Mark? He didn't answer. So I slammed my glass down on the counter. How long? He flinched. Then, finally, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he said, 6 months. I laughed again. I couldn't help it. 6 months. 6 months. While I had been crying in the shower. While I had been begging for him to see me. While I had been breaking myself apart trying to save our marriage, he had already moved on. So tell me, I said, tilting my head. Do you love her? His breath hitched. And then he said something that made my heart stop. I don't know. The air in the room changed. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I don't know. Not know. Not it was just sex. He didn't know. And somehow, that was worse. The secret that changed everything. Mark sat down at the kitchen table, burying his face in his hands. I didn't mean for it to happen. I scoffed. Oh, so you just tripped and fell into her bed? Happens all the time, right? His head snapped up, his eyes dark with something that looked a lot like pain. You think I don't hate myself for this? I didn't answer. Because I wanted him to hate himself. I wanted him to hurt. But then, his next words made me stop cold. You're not the only one who felt invisible, you know. I blinked. What? He ran a hand through his hair. You think I didn't notice when you started pulling away? When you stopped looking at me like I was the man you married? My stomach twisted. Don't turn this on me. I'm not. His voice was raw, tired. I'm saying it wasn't just one of us who let this marriage die. We both did. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was the one who shut me out first. But then I thought back. To the nights I rolled away from him in bed. To the times I chose silence instead of another fight. To the slow, creeping distance that had built between us long before Daniel. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. That still doesn't change the fact that you were screwing someone else while I was breaking myself trying to fix this. Mark exhaled slowly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, She's pregnant. The room spun. I grabbed the edge of the counter to steady myself. What? His jaw clenched. Becca, she's pregnant. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. 1,000 thoughts crashed into each other, but all I could focus on was the way my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might actually stop. Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought I had figured out, it all shattered in an instant. Because this wasn't just an affair anymore. This was something so much worse. For a long time, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles went white, staring at Mark like he had just told me the world was ending. Because, in a way, he had. Becca was pregnant. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just some passing mistake that could be erased with an apology. It was permanent. I felt something inside me crack. Mark looked exhausted, his hands in his hair, his breathing uneven. Say something. My voice came out hollow. How far along? He hesitated, then, 3 months. I did the math in my head, and my stomach turned. 3 months. That meant he had gotten her pregnant before he even noticed I was pulling away. Before I had met Daniel. Before I had done anything wrong. He was already gone. I let out a shaky laugh, but there was nothing funny about it. You really had the audacity to act like I destroyed this marriage? Mark's jaw clenched. I never said that. You didn't have to. My voice was sharp, bitter. You stormed out of here like some heartbroken husband, like I betrayed you, when all along I swallowed, trying to hold myself together. Jesus, Mark, were you ever going to tell me? Or were you just going to wait until the baby was born and hope I wouldn't notice? His head dropped into his hands. I don't know. God, you are such a FNG coward. His eyes snapped up, anger flickering across his face. And what about you? You think you're innocent? You think Daniel isn't just as much of a mistake as Becca? I let out a sharp breath. Maybe he is. But at least he actually saw me. Mark scoffed. Oh, please. You think you're special to him? You're just a sad, lonely woman who needed attention. And he gave it to you because it was easy. His words hit like a slap. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him. Then, slowly, I set my wine glass down, crossed my arms, and whispered, I hate you. Mark exhaled through his nose, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Yeah? Well, right now, I don't think I like you very much either. We stood there, breathing hard, glaring at each other like enemies. And maybe that's what we had become. The next morning, I packed a bag. Not all my things, just enough. Enough to get out of that house, to get away from him, to breathe. Mark barely looked at me as I moved around the bedroom. Where are you going? He finally asked, his voice hoarse. I zipped my bag. Somewhere you're not. I didn't know if I meant it forever or just for now. I just knew that I couldn't be there anymore. As I turned to leave, Mark said something that made me pause. I never wanted to hurt you. I closed my eyes. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you did. And with that, I walked out. Confrontation number 2, I went to a hotel, then to a friend's house. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I needed time to process before I brought him into this mess. But the universe had other plans. Because 2 days later, I ran into Becca. It wasn't intentional. I was at the grocery store, trying to remember how to do normal things like pick out cereal and pretend my life wasn't falling apart. And then I heard her voice. Excuse me. I turned. And there she was. She was younger than me. Prettier, in a fresh-faced, effortless way. A little too perfect. The kind of woman men like Mark couldn't resist because she didn't carry the weight of years and children and silent disappointments. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed, shifting the basket on her hip. I guess you know. I clenched my jaw. I know. She nodded slowly. I'm not going to apologize. A sharp laugh escaped me. Wow, not even going to fake it. She lifted her chin. Would it make a difference? I studied her. The way she held herself. The way she looked at me. Not with guilt, but with a kind of quiet sadness. Like she already knew how this would end. And for the first time, I realized something. Becca might have been the other woman, but she wasn't winning. She was just as screwed as I was. You really think Mark is going to pick you? I asked, tilting my head. You think he's suddenly going to be some great, devoted man just because you're having his baby? She flinched. Good. Let me guess, I said, stepping closer. He told you he loved you. That he was miserable with me. That if it weren't for the kids, he would have left already. Her face paled. He's a liar, Becca. And you? You're just his latest distraction. She swallowed hard. You don't know anything about us. I know enough. She turned away, blinking fast, her hands shaking. And for some reason, I didn't feel satisfaction. Just exhaustion. Later that night, Mark called. I almost didn't pick up. But part of me wanted to hear what he had to say. I think we need to talk, he said. I think we don't. He sighed. We can't just pretend this didn't happen. No, I agreed. We can't. Silence. Then, softly, I don't love her. I let out a long breath, pressing my fingers to my temple. Mark, I don't care anymore. Because I didn't. I was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of hating. Tired of waiting for something that had already died a long time ago. I want a divorce, I said. Mark inhaled sharply. You don't mean that. Yes, I do. Another silence. Then, finally, in a voice so broken I almost didn't recognize it, he said, okay. And just like that, it was over. The divorce was messy, as divorces always are. But in the end, we figured it out. Mark kept the house. I got shared custody of the kids. Daniel and I lasted a little while, but eventually we fizzled out too. He wasn't the love of my life, just a person who reminded me I was still capable of feeling. Becca had the baby. A boy. Mark tried to make it work with her. It lasted a year before he cheated on her too. Funny how that works. It's been 2 years now. And I won't lie, it hasn't been easy. There are still nights I wake up reaching for someone who isn't there. Still moments where I wonder if I could have done something differently. But I don't regret leaving. Because for the first time in a long time, I'm not invisible anymore. And I will never let myself disappear again.